agency problem and control the corporation. So the agency relationship occurs when a principal hires an agent to represent his or her interest. In this case, the stockholders are the principals. They hire managers who are their agents to run the company. The agency problem occurs when there's a conflict of interest between the principal and the agent. The management goals. The management goals may be different from shareholder goals. The management we want expensive perks. They may be trying to survive, independence and control, so forth. The good example of expensive perks that take place. I used to work for PNC Corporation, and when I started working there, we had an outgoing chairman, and somehow he managed to take the company's Gulfstream G4, $30 million plane with him when he left. Pretty incredible. But it's a true story. As we've talked about, increased growth and size aren't necessarily equivalent to increased shareholder wealth. The example being projects that don't generate sufficient returns, that they can make the company larger, but they won't necessarily increase shareholder wealth. In fact, they will actually decrease shareholder wealth. Managing managers. So ways, how do we do this? First way, managerial compensation. We use incentives to align management and stockholder interests. The incentive needs to be structured very carefully to make sure that they achieve their intended goal. This is why you see that executives that when they're successful, they typically make very, very large sums of money because they have some skin in the game. They own shares, they receive stock options, so forth. These are all designed to motivate them to act in the best interest of the shareholders. There's thought to be an optimal level of management exposure with regard to ownership of the firm. Corporate control. The threat of takeover is always can be a motivating factor. If the management invests in projects that don't generate sufficient returns, then the firm could potentially be undervalued. It could be a target for corporate raiders. That could corporate raiders could come in and just simply liquidate the firm for more than they paid for it, or they could change management and manage those assets more effectively. Then there are other stakeholders as well. Next is regulation. The first regulations we'll talk about is the Securities Act of 1933. This dealt with the issuance of securities. This separated banks and investment banks. Banks and investment banks were required to be separate entities up until 1999. That was relaxed in 1999. There's also thought that this relaxation contributed to the financial crisis in 2008. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the SEC and created reporting requirements. And then Sarbanes-Oxley was a direct response to the tech bust, many other things that took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. The increased reporting requirements and the responsibility of corporate directors. The CFO now has to sign a test to the validity of financial statements. So that's the end of this chapter. We'll go through the quick quiz here in just a second. So the quick first question, what are the three basic questions financial managers must answer? So the first being, what long-lived assets to invest in? Second, being where to acquire that money? Where in the capital markets are we going to borrow that money? Do we borrow short-term, long-term? Do we issue additional equity? Three major forms of business. The first being the sole proprietorship, the second being partnership, and third being corporation. Just a note, the sole proprietorship make up about 80% of all businesses in the United States. However, corporations control about 80% of the assets of businesses in the United States. So, goal of financial management, the maximization of shareholder wealth. Next, what are agency problems? Why do they exist? Agency problems we're specifically talking about the principal agent problem. In this case, the principal is the shareholder, is the agent, is management, and they exist in corporation because the goals of the management and the shareholder may not necessarily be aligned. And then finally, the major regulations, the Securities Act of 1933 that dealt with the issuance of securities, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 that created the SEC and created reporting requirements for corporations, and then Sarbanes-Oxley, which increased the responsibility of company management executives with regard to financial reporting. That is it for Chapter 1.